My name is Margaret Cole, and on the night my daughter-in-law called my father's watch cheap junk, I was standing at my own kitchen counter up to my elbows in turkey grease and doubt. The house smelled like roasted garlic and pine. Christmas music hummed from the old radio Tom bought me our first year of marriage, its volume just low, enough that I could still hear the chatter from the dining room. My son Dan was out there pouring wine. His wife, Arya, was circling the table with her phone held high, making sure every angle of my dining room looked aesthetic, enough for whatever video she was planning to post later. I kept my back to them for a moment, longer than necessary, fingers resting on the small velvet box by the sink. Inside was the only thing of my father's I had left, a battered gold pocket watch that had lived more years in his grease-stained coveralls than most jewelry ever sees in a display case. I'd carried it in my apron pocket through decades of hard days at the hardware store. Tonight, for the first time, I was going to hand it to someone else. "Mom, are you almost done in there?" Dan called. His voice sounded cheerful, but there was a tightness in it I knew too well. The kind you get when you're trying to keep everyone happy. "Just about," I answered, drawing my hands. My heart beat harder than it had any right to for a simple walk from the kitchen to the dining room. I rounded the corner with the velvet box in my hand. Everyone looked up. Arya tilted her phone toward me, her smile camera ready. "What's that?" she asked, like I was bringing in a party trick instead of a piece of my heart. "This," I said, setting the box in front of my son, "belonged to your great-grandfather. Your dad wore it every day he worked at the store. I think it's time it stayed with you." Dan's eyes softened as he opened the lid. He drew in a breath. Arya leaned in too, and for a second I let myself believe she might understand. She didn't. But to tell you why that one careless moment at my dining table changed everything, I have to start long before Arya ever walked into our lives. When I think back to the beginning, truly the beginning, it isn't the store, or the marriage, or even the grief that shaped me the most. It's the sound of my grandfather's tools in that tiny repair shop where I spent half my childhood. The steady clicking of a socket wrench, the hum of an old fan in the corner, the faint smell of motor oil clinging to the wooden walls. That little shop sat right behind his house, a squat brick building with a hand-painted sign that said, "Frank's Repairs." No matter how cold the Colorado wind blew each winter, you could always count on Grandpa Frank being in there, bent over an engine with a cigarette tucked behind his ear and a joke ready for anyone who walked through the door. I'd sit on an overturned milk crate and watch his hands move, slow, deliberate, never rushed. He had a ritual. Before he opened up each morning, he'd wind the gold pocket watch he kept in his coveralls. It wasn't shiny or precious in the way people use those words now. The metal was scratched, the chain was dull, and the engraving had worn so soft you could barely make out the initials. But to him, that watch marked time the way a heartbeat does. He used it to track the promises he made to customers. "I'll have it ready by noon," or "give me 20 minutes, kiddo." And he always kept his word. One snowy afternoon when I was maybe 10, he pressed that watch into my palm. His hands were big and rough, and mine were small enough that the watch felt like a heavy coin. "There's going to be a lot of world that tries to tell you who you are," he told me. "But if you remember your name and your work, no one can take that from you." I didn't understand it then. I do now. Years later, when I met my husband, Tom, that same feeling washed over me. The sense that I was standing next to someone who knew the value of quiet work and honest days. Tom wasn't flashy or loud. He was a mechanic who liked country music, strong coffee, and the way fresh-cut lumber smelled on a chilly morning. When we married, we combined what little savings we had and opened the very first Kohl's Home and Hardware in Redstone. It was a narrow storefront wedged between a laundromat and a bakery with peeling paint and shelves we'd sanded by hand. Tom wore my grandfather's watch in his back pocket every day we worked. There, he said it reminded him, not just of Frank, but of the promise that the two of us were building something steady. Those early years were hard. There were winters when business was slow and I counted out rolled quarters just to pay the utility bills. There were nights when Tom and I stayed late to restock lumber or repaint signage because hiring extra help wasn't in the budget. But even in the exhaustion, we were happy. There was a kind of intimacy in working side by side, finishing each other's tasks the way some couples finish each other's sentences. When our son Dan was born, we built a little crib in the back office so he could nap while we worked. Life had a simple rhythm then. Store opens at 8. Tom handles the tool rentals. I ring up customers. Dan eats crackers in his high chair. Lunch was usually a sandwich split between us at the counter. Somehow the days felt fuller back then, even when we didn't have $2 to rub together. The store grew, piece by piece, customer by customer. By the time Dan hit middle school, we'd expanded to a second location. A few years later, a third. It was never glamorous, but it was solid, and it was ours. When Tom died suddenly from a heart attack, the sound that haunted me wasn't the hospital machines or the doctor's hushed voice. It was the quiet in the back office the day after his funeral. I sat at the same desk where we'd once balanced invoices and baby bottles, and I pulled out my grandfather's watch from the drawer. The hands were stuck at 7:42, the last time Tom had wound it. I held it so tightly, my fingers ached. For a moment I didn't know if I had it in me to keep the business running, to keep our life running. But the weight of that watch felt like the weight of every promise I'd ever made to my grandfather, to Tom, to myself. So I kept going day by day, order by order, payroll by payroll. Dan grew up and went off to college. I grew older and learned to live with a new kind of quiet. But through it all, I kept that watch in the pocket of my apron, letting its familiar shape remind me who I am. And that's why years later, when I placed it into Dan's hands on that Christmas night, it wasn't just a gift. It was everything we had, weathered, everything we had built, everything I still believed in. I just didn't know then how quickly someone could try to throw it all away. When Dan moved back to Redstone after college, I remember thinking how lucky I was. Most kids his age were running toward big cities and bigger lives, but he came home with a degree in operations and a quiet confidence that made him look older than his 20-some years. He slipped back into the rhythm of our stores like he'd never left. I taught him everything Tom once taught me. How to read a supplier's tone better than their contracts, how to spot a dishonest customer, how to talk to the ones who only came in because they were lonely. We fell into a comfortable routine, especially our Saturday breakfasts at Ruby's Diner. Same booth, same waitress, same jokes about how Dan still couldn't drink his coffee black. Those mornings were the kind of steady joy a mother doesn't take for granted, which is probably why I noticed the shift the moment he mentioned her. He came into the shop one afternoon smelling faintly of cologne, hair a little too neat, humming a song I didn't know. When I asked what had him in such a good mood, he smiled, the kind of bashful smile he hadn't worn since high school. I met someone, he said, adjusting a stack of invoices like they needed fixing. Her name was Aria Blake. He told me she had just moved from Los Angeles, made lifestyle videos, worked with brands, had a really infectious energy. I didn't know what a lifestyle video was, and I didn't want to embarrass myself by asking. So I just nodded and said, I'd love to meet her. That meeting happened sooner than I expected. Dan brought her to dinner at my house the following week. I'd made roast chicken and mashed potatoes, something warm and traditional. Arya swept in, wearing a cream-colored coat that looked too soft for snowy weather, and she didn't bother taking it off before she reached for her phone. She spun in a slow circle, filming my dining room, my grandmother's china, the crocheted table runner Tom's Mother made the candles I only pulled out for company, she narrated softly, under her breath about the cozy small town vibe, the charming old farmhouse style. It took me a minute to realize she was recording content, not complimenting me. When she finally sat down, she flashed a perfect smile and said, "Thank you for having us. Margaret, you've got such a vintage aesthetic." Her tone made it sound like I had collected these things from a thrift store rather than lived a lifetime with them. I tried to be gracious. Dan was glowing beside her, hanging on her every word. He didn't seem to notice the way she picked at her food or how she stopped me mid-story to get better lighting for a picture of her wine glass. I reminded myself that young people live differently now. Maybe this was normal. Maybe she was just nervous. But then came the comments about the stores. "So Dan says he's managing all 3 locations," she said between photos. "That must be a lot of work. Have you ever considered selling the chain? You could probably make a killing and retire somewhere warm," she said. Warm, as if Redstone were a punishment. Or, she continued, we could modernize it, rebrand, add an online shop, maybe even a full renovation. Imagine the content, opportunities. I felt something uneasy settle in my stomach. Not anger, not yet. Just the sense that she didn't see years of sweat and sacrifice. She saw a business to flip, a backdrop for a curated life. Still, Dan was smitten. He brought her to every family barbecue, every small town festival, every 4th of July parade. Arya took pictures of everything. Children blowing bubbles, veterans marching, even the hamburgers sizzling on the grill. "It's research," she'd say. "Small town nostalgia performs really well online." By fall, they were engaged. The proposal happened at a vineyard 2 hours away, complete with a drone photographer and a montage video. Uploaded the next morning. I watched the clip more times than I care to admit. Not because I loved it, but because I couldn't find my son anywhere in it. The video was all Arya. Her dress, her hair, her angles. Dan appeared only twice, and both times he looked like a supporting actor. The wedding planning came next, and with it the bill. Arya wanted a rustic luxury ceremony at the same vineyard with chandeliers hanging from reclaimed barn beams, a string quartet, and a custom archway made of birchwood and roses. She spoke about it like it was a brand launch, not a marriage. I tried to keep up, but every meeting with the planner left me with a headache and an invoice that made my chest tighten. Dan assured me they would cover a portion, but somehow every large expense landed in my lap. I didn't complain. My parents had helped with my wedding. It felt right to help with his. What I didn't expect was how quickly those joyful preparations would turn into something that began to edge me out of my own family. After the wedding and after the honeymoon photos were posted, edited, and reposted, they moved into my house under the idea of saving for a place of their own. At first I didn't mind. The house had felt too quiet since Tom passed, and it comforted me to hear footsteps again. But within a month, framed photos of Tom disappeared from the hallway. The yellow curtains from our first year of marriage were replaced with neutral drapes Arya called light optimized. She labeled my kitchen jars with sleek black stickers and rearranged every drawer. She even suggested repainting the living room for better video brightness. I told myself these were minor things, the kinds of changes young women make when they're building a home. But the first morning, Dan canceled our Saturday breakfast at Ruby's, saying Arya wanted to film at sunrise. I felt that same quiet unease return. Something was shifting, and though I couldn't name it yet, I could feel the ground beginning to move beneath my feet. I began noticing the changes in ways so small they almost slipped past me. A receipt left on the counter for a boutique hotel in Denver. A delivery box on the porch containing a sequin dress Arya said she needed for filming. A charge on the company card for a spa package labeled brand partnership prep. At first, I assumed Dan had accidentally put business and personal expenses on the same card. Mistakes happen. I told myself not to worry, but the statements kept coming. One afternoon, I sat in the office at the back of our main store, a space that still smelled faintly of Tom's shaving cream because I couldn't bring myself to repaint the walls. I clicked open the latest credit card report, expecting the usual supplier runs and delivery fees. Instead, line after line listed restaurants in Denver, clothing from high-end boutiques, luxury hotel stays, and something called a content optimization retreat. The total was more than I had spent on my first car. I stared at those numbers until they blurred. This wasn't accidental, and it wasn't business-related. When Dan came by the office to grab inventory sheets, I asked gently, "Honey, did you mean to put all these on the company card?" He didn't look at me. He just rubbed the back of his neck. "Arya's helping with marketing. Mom, you have to spend money to make money. The stores need a new image." I wanted to tell him that our customers didn't come to us for an image. They came for honesty, reliability, the promise that if something broke, we'd fix it. But he was already halfway out the door, muttering about meeting Arya for lunch. I watched him leave, feeling a pressure in my chest I hadn't felt since the day I sat alone after Tom's funeral. The distance between us grew thicker in the weeks that followed. Saturday breakfast disappeared entirely. If I asked Dan a question, Arya often answered for him, with a sugary tone that felt more condescending than sweet. When I tried to talk to her about the expenses on the company account, she shifted in her seat and said things like, "This is just how the industry works, Margaret," as if she were explaining something to a child. Then came the night everything tipped. It was late, close to 11 o'clock, and the house was dark, except for the glow spilling from under the kitchen door. I had gone downstairs for a glass of water. As I passed the bottom of the staircase, I heard Arya's voice drifting from the living room, sharp and clear. She was on speakerphone, pacing back and forth, unaware that I stood just out of sight. "I'm telling you," she said, her tone exasperated. "Once Dan has full control of the stores, we're set. We sell or lease, move back to the coast, and actually live. I'm not spending my life in this snow globe town." A woman's voice, Sharon, laughed softly. "Just play nice with the old lady until then. She's lonely. It won't be long." My breath caught. For a moment I wondered if I'd misheard. Maybe it was a joke. Or maybe I was too tired. But then Arya continued, voice dropping to a cruel whisper. "When she's gone, everything's his. And you know, Dan, he'd give me the moon if I asked. We just have to wait." I felt something inside me go very still. Not anger, not heartbreak. Something colder, steadier. The same thing I'd felt years ago when I stood at my husband's graveside and realized I was the only one left to carry our life forward. I slipped my phone from my robe pocket, pressed record, and captured the next few minutes. Arya mocking my antique cooking, Sharon complaining that the guest room mattress wasn't firm enough, and both of them laughing about how easy Dan was to manage. I went upstairs without making a sound. My hands shook as I placed the phone on my nightstand, but my mind was clear in a way it hadn't been in months. I didn't sleep. Instead, I waited for the sun to rise, for the law office in town to open. At 9 sharp, I walked into the same attorney's office where Tom and I had signed our will decades earlier. The receptionist looked surprised to see me. I'd always kept my affairs simple, but that morning I asked to revise everything. The attorney listened quietly as I explained my concerns carefully without bitterness, just facts. We updated the trust. Most of the assets would be protected, untouchable until a future grandchild turned 25. Dan would still have a role in the business but limited access to accounts, and Arya's name removed from everything. As I signed the final document, a strange grief washed over me. I hadn't expected that part. I thought protecting my legacy would give me nothing but relief. But sitting there, pen in hand, I realized I wasn't just guarding the business or the money. I was accepting a possibility I'd spent months refusing to face, that I could lose my son. Walking out of the office, I clutched the folder to my chest, the fall air bit at my cheeks as if to remind me I was still alive, still capable of action, still the woman Tom had believed me to be. But beneath that, something else stirred. A warning, a promise. This wasn't over. Not yet. The air in the dining room shifted the second Arya leaned over the velvet box. Dan was still admiring the engraving when she let out a small laugh, the kind people use when they want others to join in. This is the gift, she said, raising her brows toward her mother. It's old, like thrift store old. Her phone was already angled at the table. I felt my pulse in my ears, but I forced myself to stay still. It belonged to your great-grandfather, I reminded her. Your father carried it every day. Arya pinched the watch between two fingers, the way someone might handle something sticky. Well, it scratched, she said, shrugging. Honestly, Margaret, you could have at least cleaned it. It's cheap junk. Then she let it drop. The sound of metal hitting hardwood cracked through the room like a bone snapping. Conversation stopped. Sharon pressed her lips together, pretending to hide a smile. Dan froze, torn between his wife and the history lying broken at his feet. I bent down, lifted the watch, and felt the crack in its glass like a crack inside my own chest. Dan, I asked softly, anything you want to say? He opened his mouth, closed it again, and whispered, let's just not make a scene. That was the moment something in me settled. Not anger, but certainty. I straightened, pulled out my phone, and dialed the car leasing company. This is Margaret Cole, I said loud enough for the table to hear. I'm terminating responsibility for the SUV under the Cole business account. Effective immediately. Sharon blinked. Arya's smile finally faltered. Next, I called the bank. Remove Daniel Cole from all company cards. Restrict access to payroll only. My voice didn't shake. It surprised me. Dan's face drained. Mom, I set the broken watch on the table between us and pressed play on my phone. Arya's voice filled the room, clear and sharp. When she's gone, it's all his. Then it's mine. Sharon's laugh followed, like a second slap. Arya's hand flew to her mouth. Dan stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. They moved out within the week. By spring, Dan was back at the store, starting from the bottom, stocking shelves, earning back trust one shift at a time. Arya took a retail job in Denver. Months later, she walked into my shop, eyes softer, voice smaller, and apologized without excuses. I forgave her, not because she deserved it, but because I needed the peace. That Christmas, Dan placed the repaired watch on my mantle and said, it should stay with you, Mom. And for the first time in a long time, the house felt like home again.